Welcome back. So today we are talking about the relationship between morality and religion. So objectives today, we want to understand, discuss, and critique various accounts of the relationship between God and ethical theory. We'll consider two such theories, the arguments for them and the objections to each. The first will be the divine command theory of ethics. And the second, we will consider the Euthyphro dilemma for divine command theory. Then we'll consider natural law theory and some objections to natural law theory. And I'll suggest to you some work you can do at home. This is sort of practice for uh, coming up with paper ideas. And in fact, these might be your idea for your paper, right? But at the very least, it's something you can practice uh, getting that part of your brain working of coming up with something. It's a little illustration of how that can happen and where that is likely to happen, in the context of an argument. Right. So Rachel's begins this discussion of religion and morality uh, with a sort of little vignette from history involving Alabama Judge Roy Moore. Um, he was a judge in the state of Alabama in 1995, and he was sued by the ACLU because he had the Ten Commandments displayed in his courtroom. According to the ACLU, this was a violation of the separation of church and state, which, on their interpretation, is guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. Now, Moore was overwhelmingly popular in the very, conservative and religious state of Alabama, and despite the controversies generated by the lawsuit, he was later elected Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court. Right, it's about as high as you can go as a judge in Alabama. So maybe as a little sort of sticking it to the ACLU, he secretly in the night installed a giant sculpture of the Ten Commandments in front of the court building. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he was once again sued, of course, for erecting the statue without permission. Uh, and at any rate, his reasons, right, for what he was doing was that he was following, quote, God's law. And people surveyed, I don't know if this was just people surveyed in Alabama, but of them, 77% agreed with Moore, right? So where was Moore coming from here, right? So he is meant to be an arbiter of what is legal, right? Often we think that what is legal and what is ethical, they're not exactly the same thing, but there should be some relationship between the legal and the ethical. At the very least, um, it should be legal to do what's ethical, right? Even if it's not required. It might be ethical to help the poor, but maybe you don't want the laws to force you to help the poor, but it certainly should at least allow you to, right? Um, and then Moore also sees a connection between, right, morality and God and the Bible and the Ten Commandments. So he's not alone in this, right? In the United States, there's relatively few Americans who directly admit to being atheists if you poll them. Um, but if you ask more sort of indirect questions that get at the same idea, you can come to the conclusion that about 26% of Americans don't believe in God, about a quarter of them. 75% of Americans say they're Christians. So this is adding up to more than 100% here. So uh, there's, depending on how you do the survey, sometimes that can happen, right? But at any rate, broadly, right, big chunk of Americans think they're Christians. Relatively small minority think that they are atheists, and a majority of Americans say that religion is very important in their life. Members of the clergy are often seen as guides to morality. So, for example, uh, there's a board of people who decide the ratings for movies, right? They say, well, there's too much, cursing in this, or too much, so there's nudity or whatever, and they decide that it's an R rating or PG rating or whatever. And you know, clergy people are on those committees that decide those things. You might right? They're making an ethical choice about who should be allowed to watch these movies, things like that. So why the clergy? Why don't they have, ethicists in people, you're right, with PhDs in philosophy? Why aren't they on those committees? Why are the clergy people on instead? Um, I mean, the reason seems to be, like, obviously, that for many people in this country and around the world, morality and religion are very closely related. But we'd like to analyze exactly what is that relation and when and how is it justified, right? Assumption. So, this is intuitive. It feels natural. You almost wouldn't want to question it, but uh, in philosophy, we question everything. So, what is the connection between morality and religion? Well, one way to think about it is to contrast the religious view of the universe with the scientific view, right? Um, the scientific view of humans and our place in the universe is that we are a very small part of the universe, that we came to be as the result of the Big Bang, some basic laws of nature, a little random probability mixed in, and we just happen, right? Evolution and spawned, right? So, if with evolution, right, there's just random genetic mutations that are then, some of those um, allow for species to better survive and have more offspring, and nothing needs to be directed by any greater being. It all just happens according, to these basic laws of nature. And insofar as science has anything to say, and sometimes they'll just say nothing about it, but when we die, as far as science knows, that's the end of us, right? Um, and then ultimately, humankind will die when the sun explodes and the Earth. Maybe humankind will move on to other planets, but eventually, if the universe is expanding, eventually the universe will cool down and become uninhabitable as well. So, humankind, according to science, is relatively small, not particularly important, and will not last forever. Look at the religious view, however, and humankind is central to many religions, right? They think that we are the deliberate and sort of greatest creation of an omnibenevolent, right, all good God who is in control of the universe, guiding everything so as to produce the best outcome. And this is particularly clear in what we call the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, right? They're monotheistic. They have one God who's in charge of everything, and humans are his primary concern. The scientific view doesn't say a lot about what we should do ethically either, right? Whereas on the religious view, right, there is a God in charge, and the God has rules about what's right and what's wrong, and he has a purpose, right? And you're supposed to do the right thing, the thing God wants you to do, so as to fulfill the purpose that God has in mind, and to direct you to your sort of greatest outcomes or what God would like for you, right? So it makes sense at least why, if you're looking for a guide to ethics, science isn't going to help you very much, and the religious traditions have a very rich story, right? Very rich history and worked out sort of theology of how ethics um, fits into the grand scheme of the universe. Right? So, it is true. Is God the source of morality? Well, here's one way, right? Here's one account which says that yes, God is the source of morality. Um, there are basically two main approaches, right? One way you could say that morality is connected to God is to say that the moral rules are invented by God and then communicated to us. Right? So on that view, right, if I say you take my ethics class and I say, oh, here's something you may not have heard about, but ethically murder is wrong, and you ask me, well, why, Nate? Because as a philosopher, I've trained you to ask why in every situation. And my answer is God says so, right? Um, that could be one approach to ethics, right? Whenever you ask, well, why is it wrong to steal? God says so, right? Why is it wrong to disrespect your parents or to harm people? Because God says so, right? Um, you know, it's an answer, right? It is a reason. One nice thing about this approach, it solves this problem of objectivity, right? We've dealt with last week all these problems of subjectivity. It doesn't seem that wrongness just sort of appears in the world. Again, you see me walking on the street kicking a puppy, and you see me, you see the puppy, you see the kicking, but where is the wrongness? Is there some sort of extra blob of wrongness that appears? It doesn't seem so, right? And so the subjectivists and the relativists have suggested that, you know what, maybe the wrongness is in our minds, right? The world is just people and puppies, and sometimes there's kicking, and sometimes there isn't. And what happens is psychologically, we add the wrongness. We say, I don't like that. That feels wrong, right? And we label it as wrong. And we've seen all the problems with subjectivism last week, right? But so if there are these problems with subjectivism and we would like to have some objective morality, it would be nice if that blob of wrongness was just there and we could see it like anything else and it was just a scientific study, right? But that's not the case. But is there some other way that we could get objectivity in ethics? Well, one way is God, right? If God exists, then we could locate the source of the rightness and the wrongness in God, right? Now, God isn't directly observable by everybody, but he is in principle observable and therefore objective, right? So if presumably, if God exists and he so chose, he could reveal himself to everyone and everyone could see God and say, ah, there is God, right? So God isn't subjective in the same way that feelings about, right, kicking puppies subjective. God, if he exists, would be an objective phenomenon and would make morality objective. So that's nice. An objectivity, Rachel's has argued all last week, uh, is preferable if we can get it. The other nice thing, right, about God being just, hiding what's right and wrong, uh, gives us a motivation to obey the moral laws. Why? So, if I say murder is wrong, you say, okay, fine. Um, well, I'm going to do it anyways. I say, no, you shouldn't do it, right? It's wrong, so you shouldn't do it. You might say, why? And I can say, well, you'll go to hell, right? God will punish you. So, it's a nice, compact, neat story that gives us a lot of things we would like out of a theory of ethics, right? Objectivity, motivation for actions, things like that. But as you might have predicted, there are some problems with the divine command theory. And they boil down to how you interpret it. And there seems to actually be no good way to interpret it that makes a lot of sense, right? On the surface, it sounds what could be simpler, but when you look into it and dig more deeply, it's actually sort of baffling approach. So, I mean, the other problem is if you don't believe in God, then this is not going to be very attractive to you, right? But let's set that aside, right? Even if you do believe in God, right, and think, oh yeah, this makes sense. Maybe, yeah, God could be the source of morality. Um, there's still going to be problems for you, right, the believer. And these problems were pointed out by Socrates, right, around 400 BCE. Uh, famous Greek philosopher. I presume you've heard the name Socrates. I can say a lot more about Socrates, but this isn't, of course, ancient Greek philosophy. But interesting guy. We'll get into it a little bit. So Socrates, I'll say a little bit about him. Uh, he was a philosopher, but not in the sense that we have these days, where he had a job at a university. Um, he was more just a guy who wandered around town, and everyone recognized that he was very smart and very wise. And what he would do is he would kind of hang out in the town square and just bump into people and say, "Hey, what are you doing? What are you up to?" Right? And they would start to talk, and he would just sort of question them. He would keep questioning them, and what they would end up doing is stumbling into these deep philosophical issues, right? And he was actually very annoying to many people, and he was eventually some folks that didn't like Socrates trumped up some charges against him of corrupting the youth and preaching like new gods, right? Which wasn't exactly what he was doing at all. Um, but nonetheless, they got people to convict him, and then he was executed. He was forced to drink poison. So everything Socrates did, we mainly know of through his pupil Plato, who wrote these dialogues. So they're written kind of like plays, and it'll be Socrates talking to somebody else. He'll be asking them questions, and they'll get into this philosophical puzzles. Uh, the relevant one here is called the Euthyphro. So they're usually named after the person Socrates is talking to. So Socrates is talking to Euthyphro here, and he asks Euthyphro, is the morally good thing to do good because God commands it, or does God only command it because it's already good? That is, does God create morality, right? Or does he just recognize the truth of an independent morality? And this question, at first, it's hard to tell the difference between the two choices, but it's actually a very sort of important and crucial distinction that we need to understand. Because either way, we're going to run into some problems for divine command theory. So, just telling the story of the Euthyphro. So, Socrates is left, he's usually hanging out in the Lyceum, um, but this story takes place sort of on the eve of his trial, right? He's headed to court to go have his trial, and the readers will know that eventually Socrates is going to be convicted and executed. Um, so it's Meletus who has accused Socrates of corrupting the youth by denying the traditional gods and making up new ones. Um, Socrates didn't make up new gods. He did claim to have what he called a demon or a daimon, which means something slightly different in Greek than it does in English. Sort of like a conscience, I guess, but a sort of a spirit or something that would prevent him from doing things that he thought were wrong. And this demon actually sort of basically prevented him from engaging very much in the everyday sort of business world, and it kind of forced him to run around doing philosophy, right? That was the new god they were talking about. That's right. It's kind of it's the charge is kind of like they're obviously just so you can see he wasn't pursuing wealth instead. He was just hanging around trying to find the truth. So, he runs into Euthyphro, right? And Euthyphro says, "Oh, I'm sorry you had to deal with that, Socrates. It'll probably nothing. It'll probably amount to nothing. You'll be fine, right?" Of course, everybody knows, no, it's going to be the end. So Socrates changes the subject. He says, "Enough about me. Euthyphro, what are you up to, right? Why are you headed to court?" Well, Euthyphro says, "I'm actually putting my own father on trial for murder." So what happened was one of Euthyphro's father's farm hands got drunk, got in a fight, and killed another laborer. And Euthyphro's father caught the killer and tied him up and threw him in a ditch while he tried to figure out, what to do with this murderer. And I guess he took his sweet time trying to figure it out, and the man stayed there in the ditch so long that he died of starvation. So Euthyphro said, Euthyphro's mad at his dad for killing this guy who was already a murderer. But nonetheless, Euthyphro says it's not right, right? The man needed a trial or whatever. Um, so Euthyphro's going to court to rat his dad out. Of course, Euthyphro's family members are upset, right? They say, "Hey, this guy the dad, let starve was a murderer anyways." Socrates says, "Geez, that's kind of a tricky case. How can you be sure you're doing the right thing here?" Euthyphro says, "Well, of course I know I'm right." And Socrates says, "Well," and this is how Socrates acts. He sort of plays dumb a little bit and lets people sort of trip themselves up with their own logic. So Socrates says, "Well, that's great that you know so much about right and wrong. Can you teach me? Um, because I'm gonna have to defend myself here, and if I could learn from someone like you, that would be great. That might help me in my defense." Socrates is always a little tongue in cheek. So Socrates says, "Hey, okay, explain it to me. What is piety and impiety, right? What's the difference?" Now, you can use these as synonyms for right and wrong if you like, piety and impiety. It's kind of got a little more of a religious connotation, but it's roughly the same thing. Um, So Euthyphro's first response is says, well, piety is doing what I'm doing right now, standing up against wrongdoers no matter what, even if they're your father. For example, Zeus, right, did kind of a similar thing with Zeus, the god, one of the Greek gods. He fought his own dad because his dad had swallowed some of his other sons. And Socrates says, well, no, that wasn't my question. I wasn't asking for examples of pious things that someone could do. Um, right. I was asking for like a definition, right, of right and wrong. So Euthyphro replies, okay, let's try again. He says, what is loved by the gods is pious, and what is not loved by the gods is impious. Socrates says, okay, well, that sounds like an attempt at a definition. That's great. We're on the right track. Now, the question is it true? Is it true, right? So Socrates points out, hey, the gods, they actually often disagree and fight. Um, and Socrates sort of wonders what kind of thing could cause this kind of disagreement between the gods. Um, so it can't be just on matters of fact, right? So, uh, if he says to Euthyphro, if you and me were going to disagree on like, how far it is from here to the courthouse or something, we wouldn't have to get in a big fight, right? That wouldn't be a big deal. We would just go, measure it, and that would be the end of it. So if the gods are disagreeing, right, it's not just about matters of fact. I'm sure they know a lot, and if they could always just go find out the truth if they needed to. So it must be on matters about what is right and wrong, right? For example, whether it's right to prosecute your father, or whether it's wrong. That's when people usually have these heated arguments. So is this the sort of thing that the gods are disagreeing about? Well, it must be, right? So the gods must be disagreeing about what's right and wrong, which would mean, according to your definition, Euthyphro, there are some things that some gods love and other things that the same things other gods despise it, right? That if they're disagreeing about right and wrong, then they must be disagreeing about what they love and don't love. Um, so, according to your definition, Euthyphro, since the gods disagree, um, the very same thing might be both pious and impious, and that sounds like a contradiction. Well, let's see. Like, what are the gods and people, for that matter, really disagreeing about when they dispute over moral matters? Well, they're not disagreeing that the guilty party should be punished, right? They typically are arguing the facts of the case and whether the person is guilty in the first place, right? So it's point being, people aren't usually arguing about whether murder is wrong, right? They're usually arguing over whether this person actually did the murder. So Socrates responds, okay, so maybe the gods are agreed on issues of right and wrong, and they're just, maybe they are just only arguing about the facts of the case. And anyways, of course, if you're in a monotheistic society like ours right now, this worry about all the different gods is not a problem, right? So, okay, we've gotten around this problem of the fact that in Greek society, gods will disagree. Right? And it was never a problem for us monotheists, anyways, right? But setting that issue aside, Socrates says, anyways, I don't really understand your definition. You need to clarify it for me. And this is where we get into the Euthyphro dilemma. Socrates asks, when you say that pious is what the gods love and the impious is what the gods hate, are you saying that the pious things are pious because the gods love them? Or are you saying that the gods love certain things because they are pious? So there's a section here that's a little more complicated than we need to get into here. I'm going to skip through it, but if you're interested in it, I have the slides here because some of you might want to write a paper on the Euthyphro. That is a required reading this week, so do read the Euthyphro, even though it's ancient Greek, but it's translated as best they can into English. But I will skip over this part in the lecture. It's not crucial, and it's a little confusing, to be honest. Okay, so we've reached the crucial point, right? Again, Socrates asks, is a thing right because the gods love it, or the gods love the thing because it's right? This is the Euthyphro dilemma. a dilemma has two horns, right? And it goes like this. Each one of these is a problem, right? Each horn is a little pointy when you get to the end of it, right? So as we pursue each of these interpretations of divine command theory, we'll find at each end there's a point. It's not so great for the divine command theorist. Problematic answer. So let's look at the first horn, right? Here's one interpretation of what we mean when we say, for example, murder is wrong because God says so, right? Let's assume that um, murder is wrong literally because God said it, right? Not God says murder is wrong because he's wrong. Again, I know it's tricky language, right? But we're going to deal with it over and over, and you'll be clearer on the distinction soon. So, for example, lying is wrong just because God said so. So here's some problems with it. Number one, as Rachel says, this conception of morality is mysterious. What does that mean? What's so mysterious about it? Well, first of all, it assumes that you can just make something right or wrong, which is a sort of a strange concept. Um, Typically, we think of murder as already being wrong. It's not like you can make something wrong. God is a different sort of being. Maybe it's something God can do, but like, what is he doing when he makes murder wrong, right? It can't be like making a chair or a cake, or when God makes, you know, cows exist or something. Uh, it seems like a slightly different sort of thing to then make murder wrong. He on right on day two he made cows, and then on day three he made murder wrong. Is that this exact same process? Maybe it's a little confusing, right? Well, maybe the best analogy we could have for it is making a law, right? Making a command. So it's like a decree. God is sort of like passing laws here. It's like Congress does. They're the basic laws of morality, right? So still a bit metaphorical and a little mysterious, but let it pass for now, okay? If that's the case, then God could just as easily have made murder right, right, and commanded that you must murder, right? Because in this interpretation, it's just a law he passes, right? It's just whatever he decides to write in the Ten Commandments, that becomes the law. And it seems that God could have easily carved into the Ten Commandments, right? Thou shalt murder. So that feels a little weird, right? um, and a little mysterious, right? But let's and it sort of leads us to a further problem with this interpretation um, of divine command theory. So this conception of morality is not only a bit mysterious, it makes God's commands arbitrary. So again, according to divine command theory, God is sort of like a parent just saying, because I said so, right? If you met God and you said, hey, God, I'm just curious, why did you command us not to kill? Why did you decide to make murder wrong? He would have to say, there is no reason, right? The command is the reason, right? That is rock bottom. That is where the questions about morality end, right? Because I made it so. Um, just by hypothesis here on this theory, there is no further reasoning, right? The command is what makes it moral, which means that there's no reason that God couldn't have commanded the opposite for any command that he made. So he could have commanded us to lie, murder, and steal. It just so happens that he commanded us not to. Uh, Again, but if you went to ask God, hey, why did you say that murder was wrong instead of right? There would be no reason. The command is the reason. So it seems to make it entirely arbitrary that lying is wrong, right? And lying isn't right. So we're still just on the first horn, the first interpretation of divine command theory, where there's nothing more, no reasons behind morality beyond God's command. That's it, right? So it's mysterious, it's arbitrary. The third problem is it seems to provide the wrong reasons for our moral principles, right? So it seems odd to say, why is murder wrong? Because God said so. God, why did you say so? There's no answer beyond that, right? Because we actually do have reasons. We know what the reasons are for why murder is wrong, right? And for why things like child abuse are wrong. It's because it harms, right? Child abuse is wrong because it harms an innocent person for no good reason. It has these long-term negative psychological effects, right? You ask anybody why child abuse is wrong, they'll give you a whole host of reasons, right? But divine commands theory says, no, no, those are not the reasons. Those reasons are irrelevant. The only reason that child abuse is wrong is because God commands it, period. Right? Which seems weird, right? That would seem to entail that if God had never existed, child abuse wouldn't be wrong, but of course it would be, right? There's all sorts, we know that it's wrong to harm an innocent person. We don't have to even consult the Bible for that. And, there's the further issue of like, if divine command theory is true, figuring out what commands, because people really disagree on that stuff. But you don't have to be a biblical scholar, right? Or even have heard of the Bible to know that child abuse and murder are wrong. Right? There's obvious reasons for that. So, yeah, these are three problems with divine command theory on the first interpretation. So maybe there's a better interpretation. Like, let's think of another way that we could figure out this relationship between God's commands and morality. Maybe God commands what God commands because it is good independently, right? Meaning, the reasons we would cite for murder being wrong or child abuse being wrong, yeah, God sees those same reasons and says, yeah, exactly, right? So if you had your conversation with God and said, hey, God, why did you command child abuse to be wrong? He would say all the normal things that we would say. He'd say, like, oh, well, it harms an innocent person for no reason, and so on, right? So on this theory, God is all knowing, right? So he has the best access to moral truths, right? He can do the best sort of reasoning about morality. Um, so he kind of figures out what's right and wrong the same way we would. He's just really, really better at it. And then he reports it back to us. And says, here, I've figured out right and wrong for these various issues. Here you go. Now you don't have to figure it out. But, if you try, you'll come up with the same reasons. So that fixes all our problems about, more morality being mysterious, arbitrary, or like justified in the wrong way. Because on this view, it's right, morality is figured out the way we would, right? Based on the same sorts of reasons, God is just infinitely better at reasoning. The only problem with the second horn is it isn't divine command theory. It admits that there's an independent standard of goodness, and it's not God's commands that make the thing good. Instead, right, it's God looking at a thing saying, oh, that's good. I'll command that people do that. But that has to be the right interpretation, right? The first horn seems insane, right? That God could just as easily, command that murder is right. Um, so to accept the second horn, however, is to say divine command theory is false. There are other reasons for morality besides um, God commanding it. So divine command theory in the first horn, right, is actually sort of insulting, right? Because it makes God seems sort of arbitrary and profoundly amoral, if not immoral, right? Doesn't really seem to care about harmed innocent people when he's commanding murder be wrong, right? That doesn't seem like any God uh, that we would care about. So, right, to command the good is to be sensitive to the reasons that make a thing good, but the first horn is not that. Okay, you made here's where I want to sort of pause. Maybe you could pause this lecture and think about coming up with a topic for your paper. Maybe this won't end up being your paper, but it's good practice for doing it. So here's a paper topic you could write on. Defend divine command theory against the problems pointed out by the Euthyphro dilemma. Right. So far we've presented divine command theory, we presented the moral theory, then we presented a number of problems for it, right? And So we're a little, what we call this is in philosophy is a dialectic, right? It's a back and forth, a sort of tennis match. One person, says, here's my theory. Someone says, here's a problem with it. And they might respond, and it can go many moves deep. Here we're just 2 moves deep, and I'm asking you, maybe go for a third. So how would you respond, right, on behalf of the divine command theorist? Imagine that you are a divine command theorist, and I've explained the Euthyphro dilemma to you, and you want to say, no, um, I hear your objection. I understand where you're coming from, but you're wrong. How would you do that? Well, I could see a couple directions you might take. You could choose one of the horns of the dilemma and argue that it's actually not really so bad, right? So you could take the first horn and say, I hear your points about the first horn, right? That it seems to make arbitrary morality arbitrary and stuff like that. Um, but actually, no, it's not so bad, and here's why, right? And the here's why, right? That's going to have to come from you, sort of originally, but think about it, see if you can come up with any ways to salvage that, right? Or you can maybe choose the second horn and say, well, no, even if we say that God is, responsive to reasons about morality, um, that doesn't mean that it's not divine command theory still, right? If you come up with a way to make the second interpretation still a version of divine command theory that's distinct from, you know, some other moral theory, you could try to do that. Or you might come up with a third way, right? So I've offered 2 horns, right? I said, here's one interpretation of divine command theory, here's the other, and they're both bad. But maybe there's more than 2 interpretations, right? Can you come up with a third one um, of what it could mean for morality to depend on God's commands? If you can, then maybe you can save divine command theory. And maybe you're not interested in saving divine command theory, but it's still a good exercise to get your brain working in that area. So I encourage you to take a moment and try to do a bit of that. If you think you come up with a good idea, shoot me an email and we can talk about it. All right, so that was divine command theory. Here is another popular view on the relationship between God and morality. Uh, divine command theory, I would say, just sort of like as far as like numbers of people that believe it, is probably not the dominant theory of morality in the Christian tradition. Uh, there's another one, natural law theory. Uh, it began with Aristotle, who was not a Christian. He was an ancient Greek. He was a polytheist. But many of his ideas, like his basic philosophy, worked their way into Christianity through medieval scholars who were reading Aristotle and really liking the way he thought and kind of thinking, even though he didn't, believe in the same God as us, he was sort of like tuned in to like some truths about God that make a lot of sense with Christianity. So Thomas Aquinas was doing this sort of thing. So to understand sort of Aristotle's approach, um, like anything in the world that you might want to study or understand, right? Aristotle said, look, there's 4 basic questions you can ask about that thing. What is it? What is it made of? How did it come to be? And what is it used for? So, for example, you encounter a knife. You say, oh, I want to learn more about knives, right? Let's look at this particular knife. So to understand it, you say, first of all, what is it, right? Well, the answer to that is it's a knife, right? What is it made of? Well, it's made of steel, right? How did it come to be? Well, it was made by a craftsman or it was made in a factory if it was mass produced. What is it for? What is its purpose? It's for cutting things, right? So you've got a good start on understanding the knife if you can answer those 4 questions. So this 4th question, though, the interesting difference between Aristotle's approach and our contemporary modern approach is the what is it for question isn't just asked about sort of, artifacts, knives, and things designed by humans with an express purpose. You can even ask what is it for natural objects, rocks, cows, stars, things like that. For Aristotle, those all have a purpose too. Teeth are for chewing, hearts are for pumping blood, right? Rain is for nourishing plants. Everything has a purpose for Aristotle. So Aristotle's account of the universe is one that is rational and orderly, right? Everything works in harmony, for everything has a function and a goal. Rain falls for plants to exist, plants grow for animals to eat, Animals exist for humans to eat, and humans are kind of the peak, right? Humans are sort of at the top of the food chain as far as food, but also as far as like functions and purposes of everything. And then the purpose of everything is for humans, according to Aristotle. And then the purpose of humans is to contemplate the universe and basically do philosophy, right? So this feels very Christian. Later Christians said, "Oh, great, right? Um, they made just one important addition, right? The Christian God was the one that designed the whole system and gave everything its purpose. So everything has a purpose, rain, cows, plants, and that purpose was put there by God. And what this does is it gives us what you call a normative standard for what should be done. Normativity is one of the things we study in ethics. Ethics is a normative enterprise, as opposed to, say, a descriptive. Uh, so you take biology, right? You're describing the world, you're understanding how it works. But at no point are you saying um, this should be or this shouldn't be, right? You wouldn't say um, it's wrong for lions to kill gazelles. Right? That's not something you would study in sort of the natural sciences. Um, so normativity is something that ethics does. It should be how things should work, as opposed to how they just do work. And so for Aristotle and for these Christian scholars, God adds that normative dimension. He says, um, right, a heart beats in order to pump blood. And if it's not pumping blood, it's doing something wrong. So, on this view, to do something wrong is to do something counter to your purpose, right, which God designed. Right? God has given everything a function, so now we know how things ought to be, and we know if we're not doing things according to their function, we're doing them wrong. So again, a heart that can't pump blood, it's a bad heart. Um, and right, we can extend this to humans as well, right? So we're a part of this natural system, and we have our functions too. So kindness and helpfulness to others, right, or beneficence, as you could call it. Um, God created humans as social creatures. We can't really live on our own, right? We have to get together in a group in order to, hunt food and things like that and protect ourselves from the elements. And so, in order to survive, you need to help each other. That's part of your function. Kind to other humans. Serial killers like Ted Bundy right there are failing at that function, and therefore what they are doing is wrong. Right? Someone who doesn't care about other people at all is not a social creature. That's a sociopath. Um, that's a pathology. That's a dysfunction, and it's a failure. Right? It's so. The nice thing about natural law theory, um, right? We're not just trying to figure out what God commands by sort of looking at the Ten Commandments or trying to argue with someone over whether it's the Quran or the Bible that gives us the correct commands, right? Um, Instead, you can use your rationality. You can look at the universe and how it all fits together in a whole. You can figure out the purposes of the rain and the cows and the plants, and you can figure out the purpose of humans. And once you figured that out, you know how you should behave. You've figured out morality. So, I mean, natural law theory is basically the dominant ethical view in Catholicism, right? So, from Aristotle to these medieval monks like Aquinas into church doctrine, and I think the largest, sect of Christianity, right? This natural law theory is kind of the dominant view in Christianity. But there, like all the theories we'll see here, there are some problems with, there are some objections to natural law theory. So the first problem is this view equates whatever is natural, right? We observe the universe and see how things function. And if things are fulfilling their function, they're good, right? So you're equating the natural with the good, but do seem to be a fair number of counterexamples. Just because something has a certain function in nature, we wouldn't say that all of those are morally good things. Take one example, right? There's a type of tropical fly whose bite causes blindness in children. Now, this fly is just doing its job, right? It goes around and it bites people, and that's sort of part of its life cycle and how it survives, um, is making children blind. But surely we wouldn't say that that's a good thing. So, think about it for yourself. Think about nature. Think about all the sort of horrific and yet perfectly natural things that go on, and ask yourself if the idea that all those are good, like all that stuff is morally good. That's hard to swallow in some cases. And you might say that natural law theory is guilty of confusing is and ought, right? So we're not going to get into these arguments. These arguments originated in Hume again. You remember Hume. Um, that the idea is that you could never derive a normative statement from logically distinct types of statements, right? So I can describe the universe all I want, right? And I can describe how um, water does nourish plants, right? And plants do nourish animals, and animals do feed humans. Right? All this stuff that the universe does. But what philosophers will, like Hume, will say, um, it's a whole extra logical leap to say that all that stuff is right and should be that way. And he says you can never make that logical leap in a valid way. Any descriptive statement of how things is will never entail a statement about how things ought to be. They're always so. For example, sex produces offspring doesn't entail sex ought to produce offspring. Right? That's been used for all sorts of, what we thought when we talked about the issue of homosexuality, right? As it sort of guided our discussion in subjectivism. Uh, just because sex does produce offspring, and even you could say has the function of producing offspring, you can't say that all sex doesn't produce offspring is somehow immoral, because that would entail that, sex after menopause is immoral, and women who are pregnant cannot have sex, right? Because they can't conceive again after they're already pregnant, and so on, right? So it just doesn't seem to be the case uh, that because things have a certain function entails anything morally at all. And hopefully not, because you don't want to say that it's moral and right for flies to cause blindness in kids, right? The problem is, if maybe this is attractive if you're sort of deeply Catholic, but if you're somebody who's more attracted to sort of the sciences and religion, uh, a lot of this stuff is not going to feel very attractive to you, and particularly because we don't believe in um, this this conception of function in the way the universe works. We have explanations from the theory of evolution about why hearts pump blood, right, and why eyes see. And it's not that they have the function to pump blood. What happens is there are random genetic mutations, right? Some genetic mutations cause the members of the species to do a worse job at having offspring, and so those mutations will not stick around. But some of them, uh, people that have them, do a statistically slightly better job of producing offspring. The, uh, a polar bear, right? So there's at one point there were bears in the North Pole, but they weren't white yet, right? Um, then a bear is randomly born with a genetic mutation that makes their coat a little lighter, right? And they blend in with the snow just a little bit better, and they're just that much better at, catching seals, and that survive that much longer and have more offspring, and before you know it, right, there's white polar bears, right? So that's the evolutionary story of how it works. Right? It's not guided. It's all you need is randomness and a lot of time. Right? Just because an evolved trait can fulfill some function, the heart can pump blood. It doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do or that it was any way guided by any greater intelligence to do that. You don't need to posit a greater intelligence, right? Um, for all we know, someday there'll be a better way to pump blood, right? And hearts will go out, right? Evolutionarily, or maybe your species will die out entirely. And at any rate, science certainly doesn't give us the view the universe is designed for humans, right? On a cosmic timescale, the dinosaurs came and went, humans will likely come and go, and some other life form will dominate the Earth. So if you're, attuned to a modern scientific worldview, it's pretty different than the one of natural law theory. So, but if you are a very religious person, um, you are unlikely to be immediately, at least, convinced by these philosophical arguments or scientific arguments, if they conflict with your church doctrine, right? Um, some people just take their religion as an indisputable premise. Um, but let's talk for a moment, even if, perhaps you're one of those people, and by all means, right? I don't mean to try to convince anyone that any religion is right or wrong, right? But I do want people to think carefully and rationally, right? Even if they say, hey, look, there are certain premises that I do not from my religion. That's fine. We can still reason. We can still talk. So if you're serious about, right, your religion, you do have to think. There is some argument and some reasoning involved in figuring out what it is your religion demands of you, right? Um, if I'm a Christian, right, what does God, for example, say about abortion? Am I required to oppose abortion, right? Must I be right pro-life? Well, that's not always an easy question to answer, right? You might simply ask your pastor, right? But your pastor is an authority on moral things, as he's supposed to be an authority on Christian doctrine, right? Which in turn is comes from being an expert in the Bible and understanding and interpreting the Bible, and a great deal of argument over how to properly interpret them. And often religious authorities will disagree, right? You ask one pastor, they'll say one thing, you ask another, they'll say another thing. So, for example, right, um, there are passages in the Bible where it sounds like Jesus is saying that rich people will never get into heaven, right? It's easier to get through the eye of a needle, right, than for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to get into heaven. There's other passages where Bible has God rewarding people with wealth for being, pious and believing in God. So it's hard to say which passage uh, is the God's view on wealth, right? Is it bad or is it a good thing? What does Christianity demand? Should I give everything away to the poor, as Jesus sometimes seems to say, or should I enlarge my own wealth, as other passages seem to say is, the natural result of being a pious person? And there's not really easy answers to that, particularly if you take your religion seriously. Just looking at the issue of abortion, right, for a moment. Um, so the term abortion doesn't appear in the Bible, right? There's not a scripture that says thou shalt not perform an abortion. Um, but there are some passages that suggest that there's a moral status for unborn fetuses. There's a quote that says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you." Seems to attribute personhood, right, to the unborn fetus. But it's tricky because there's context too. The context is not explicitly about the issue of abortion. He's talking about Jeremiah and how Jeremiah was preordained to be a prophet, right? Uh, so it may have just been specific to that prophet and God's plan for him. Elsewhere, Bible recommends execution for a woman who has sex outside of marriage, and there's no mention of whether, if the woman is pregnant, whether that might be considered an abortion or kill. At any rate, it would kill an unborn fetus if the woman was pregnant. And remember, back in those days, there was no birth control, so it was very likely if you uh, engaged in extramarital sex. So it's not clear if the Bible is saying it's okay to kill a woman and therefore kill the fetus. At any point, I don't know. I'm not a biblical theological expert. The point is that it's very difficult, and so um, it's a bit presumptuous, maybe even sacrilegious, to simply handpick verses out of context for your own purposes, right? If you're really trying to figure out what God wants from me by looking at these texts, well, you shouldn't make up your mind beforehand, right? You should be looking for what God wants. Maybe the church can help, right? That's meant to be the role of the church. Um, and Catholic and many Protestant churches are officially opposed to abortion currently. Um, so, according to Catholicism, they're not basing their view directly on Scripture, but instead deriving it from natural law theory. Uh, so, the idea is, well, look, again, there's a natural process of sex and procreation, and contraception and abortion sort of thwart this natural function of sex, and so you're doing something against a natural function, and so it would be wrong. Right? Of course, all that argument is only as good as natural law theory, and we have seen there's some problems with natural law theory. Um, one of the problems is it seems to conflict with the scientific view, and the Catholic Church wants to be on the side of science. It has officially endorsed evolution, for example. Um, Traditions do change, so even throughout history, Catholic history. So originally, a fetus was only considered a person if it had a soul, and actually, the idea used to be that the fetus uh, gained a soul later on in the pregnancy, right? Um, and the reason they were opposed to abortion is we didn't have the same sort of technology. We didn't know exactly what state the fetus was at, when it was getting the soul and when it wasn't. I mean, you can't see that on a soul on a sonogram anyways, right? So it was sort of better safe than sorry, and let's not do any abortions, right? Technically, it probably would have been okay if the fetus didn't have its soul yet, right? Which was called quickening. Um, so again, it's not entirely clear that the Catholic Church is against all abortion necessarily. It was sort of against abortion because you didn't want to make a mistake. It might have been okay, but you can't be sure, that kind of thing, right? So it's tricky, is the point, right? So again, none of this is to say that God has nothing to do with morality. Um, but the point is that, right, even if you are a person for whom a specific religion is very important and you take certain premises of that religion as basic, right, and unquestionable, it doesn't exempt you from doing the hard work and the reasoning of thinking about ethics carefully and rationally. So, in summary, again, we considered two accounts of the relation between God and morality: divine command theory, natural law theory. We saw that the Euthyphro dilemma created problems for the divine command theory. There's two interpretations, both of them seemed not great. We also saw that natural law theory had some objections that need to be dealt with. But again, that's not the end of the story. Um, that's the nice thing about philosophy. You can always jump in at any point and question these and keep right making arguments and expanding our understanding of these issues. So I encourage you, if any of these are interesting to you and you think you might want to write a paper about it, yeah, think through it and feel free to reach out to me.